The Southern Alberta Council on Public Affairs acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and we pay respect to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. We offer respect to the Métis and all who have lived on this land and made Lethbridge their home.
And this morning I'm very, very excited to welcome a friend, a mentor, an ally of workers, and a passionate labor advocate, the president of the Alberta Federation, Gil McGowan, all the way from Edmonton this morning. So he's going to be speaking on the topic of Alberta's disappearing at Advantage and what we can do about it. So please everyone welcome Gil.
Thanks very much, Krysty. As Krysty said, my name is Gil McGowan, and I have the great honor of serving as the elected president of our province's largest worker advocacy group, the Alberta Federation of Labour. And I also have the great honor of serving on our executive council with many brave and courageous labor leaders, including Krysty, who in addition to being chair of SACPA is the president of the Lethbridge District Labor Council, serving this community really well. So thank you, Krysty. Before I dive into the presentation, I want to say a couple of things about SACPA and the people of this particular community. I was telling Krysty and Knut and several others how I look forward to getting invitations from SACPA because it is a unique and singular organization in our province. So SACPA's been around for 57 years, providing a forum for the community to get together and talk about important issues. But as someone who is responsible for the whole province, I travel around, I visit every community, north, south, east, west. There is nothing anywhere else in this province like SACPA. And so not only should you pat yourselves on the back for doing this kind of community engagement work for 57 years, but you should pat yourselves on the back for being so unique. And I would actually say that SACPA is one of the things that makes this community strong. It's a platform for people to get together, to engage, to talk about important issues, but perhaps most importantly, to build community. And never doubt that that's what you're doing through an organization like this. And in fact, I was reminded just recently, if you haven't had a chance, there's a documentary that's currently airing on Netflix. It's called Join or Die. And it features the work of a social scientist named Robert Putnam, who famously wrote a book about 20 years ago called Bowling Alone. And it talked about how civil society has been sort of collapsing in on itself. And one of the reasons was because people were not getting together in fellowship like this. And so he talked about people not going to church, people not joining, groups like Elks and that kind of stuff, and also unions, right? So the social fabric is fraying, and there are very few spaces left in our society for people to get together, build bonds of friendship. And those bonds of friendship were actually the foundation of community, right? And then, but the point that he makes in the book, and then also in the documentary, which I just want to again urge you to watch, called Join or Die, the central point that he makes is that without strong community, powerful other interest groups can have their way on the democratic stage and in the economy, right? So really the only effective counterbalance to the power of the wealthy, the power of corporations and politicians that serve them, the real counterbalance is community, whether it's expressed through social service groups like SACPA, or worker groups like unions. That's the counterbalance. So that's how we counterbalance their power, but it's also how we turn a democracy into something that, something other than just happens every 4 years, right? So on behalf of my organization that's trying desperately to build that sense of community between workers in this province, I just want to congratulate SACPA for doing that work of building community and that necessary counterbalance to protect our democracy, doing that so well for so long here in Lethbridge. So Congratulations to you. Okay, so I don't have to tell you that we are living in troubled times, whether it is climate change or inequality, and now having to deal with Donald Trump and his assault on democracy south of the border, the threat of tariffs. There are no shortage of issues that we need to be concerned about as a community. I'm not going to try to cover that waterfront. Maybe some questions about those issues will come up in the question and answer session. I'm happy to address them, perhaps especially the issue of tariffs, which we in the labor movement are engaging with, and it has big implications for the whole Canadian economy, but also Alberta. But for our purposes today, I'm going to just focus on one area that we in the Alberta labor movement are very concerned about right now, and that is the issue of wages. Okay? And hence the title of my talk today, The Disappearing Wage Advantage, why we need to fight the trends that we're experiencing now, and because we're talking about a collapse in Alberta's living standards, okay? So, have you been feeling like you're falling behind? Does it feel like your standard of living is slipping? You're not alone. And you're not imagining things. The truth is that the Alberta Advantage, the much vaunted Alberta Advantage, is disappearing right before our eyes, and this is particularly true for working class Albertans. And when I say working class Albertans, I mean people who are paid by the hour, who work in blue-collar professions. These are the backbone of the Alberta economy and Alberta society. People are anxious about their personal finances in a way that has not necessarily been the case in this province for a long time. So you see a picture here of people doing what many of us have been doing with more anxiety, growing levels of anxiety over the past number of years, figuring out how to pay their bills. So we at the Alberta Federation of Labour, as our province's largest worker advocacy group, we wanted to understand the trends in wages that are causing so much anxiety for our members and other Albertans. We wanted to look under the hood. So in order to help us with that job, we entered into a partnership with Jim Stanford, who many of you will know. He is perhaps Canada's most prominent progressive economist. He spent years working as the chief economist for the Canadian Auto Workers Union, which became Unifor. For the past 10 years, he's run a think tank called the Centre for Future Work, and his expertise is in labor economics. As an interesting aside, he's also an Albertan. He grew up in Calgary, and so he maintains some close ties with our province, ties that we we shamelessly exploit sometimes. So, so over the last year, in cooperation with the Alberta Federation of Labour, Jim has prepared 2 reports on wages and the economy in Alberta. The first was published last May, called Alberta's Disappearing Advantage, and the second report was an update on that first report that was released just a couple of weeks ago, and it's called the Alberta Wage Advantage. So the first one dealt with the whole economy, including wages. The second one just focused on what's happening with wages in particular. So there are QR codes there that you could use your phone to download the reports, but you can also find them on the Alberta Federation of Labour website, afl.org. Okay, so as I said, we wanted to look under the hood, what's happening with the Alberta economy, especially in the context of wages for working class Albertans. So what did we find? First, Alberta is no longer exceptional among Canadian provinces. We are average. This is not what we've been told for years. People remember starting during the Klein era, this phrase, the Alberta Advantage, became something that was repeated over and over again. It was a central talking point for successive Conservative governments. We are exceptional, they said. We are better than everyone else. We are recipients of the Alberta Advantage. But when it comes to wages, that advantage is not just disappearing, it has disappeared already. So in 2023, what our report shows is that we lost our lead in terms of average hourly wages to British Columbia. Perhaps even more surprisingly, in 2024, the next year, we fell behind Quebec as well. So we're not number one in terms of average hourly wages in Canada anymore. We're not number two. We are now number three. At the same time, we've had the dubious distinction as a province of registering the slowest wage growth in Canada over the past 5 years, since 2019. Not coincidentally, that corresponds with the election of the UCP. And we'll get back to that. So our slow wage growth has been made worse by also having another dubious distinction. Alberta has had the highest rate of inflation over the past 2 or 3 years. So the whole country has experienced unprecedented rates of inflation, caused by a number of different factors. So supply chain disruptions related to COVID, the war in Ukraine, price gouging by corporations who took advantage of the pandemic, used it as a pretext to jack up prices in places like grocery stores, at the pump for gas. Lots of companies used this environment as a pretext to jack up their prices far above what their input costs were. But here in Alberta, we had higher inflation than everyone else. So you put those two things together, wages going down, costs going up, we have a crisis in wages, which in turn has caused a crisis in living standards. So specifically, in the private sector, after you adjust for inflation, and this is important, so real wages with real purchasing power, private sector wages after adjusting for inflation are down 5% over the past 5 years, and they're down even further for public sector workers. Down the real purchasing power of the average salary and wages for people working in Alberta's public sector is 10% lower after adjusting for inflation than it was 5 years ago. We are the only province where average real wages are lower now than they were in 2019, the only Canadian province. And this is a really important point, because in most other provinces, even though they all suffered through this period of high inflation, most of them have caught up in the last 6 months, okay? We have not. So these are charts taken from the second report, the one specifically on wages, and they sort of illustrate some of the points that I've made, but I'm going to walk you through them just so you can see them graphically. And once again, all of these charts are available in those 2 reports that I mentioned at the outset that are available on our website, so if you're interested, you can get them there. So this first one talks about hourly wages, and it compares 2013, which was the high water mark for average wages in Alberta, with 2024. And so there's a bar for the Canadian average, that's red, a bar for Alberta, which is blue, a bar for BC, which is orange, and then a bar for Quebec, which is light blue, okay? And so what you'll see on the left side of the screen is that in 2023, our average hourly wages were dramatically higher than both the Canadian average and also those provinces that were closest to us. So we, it was quite a bit higher. But now what you see in 2024 is that we've actually fallen below BC, Quebec, and we're barely above the Canadian average. So the Alberta Advantage in terms of hourly wages has truly disappeared, okay? This is another way of looking at the same information. but it really tells a story. So back in 2010, 2012, 2013, average wages, hourly wages in Alberta were fully 17% higher than the Canadian average, okay? And you can see what's happened over the intervening years. We're only 1.7% or 2% higher in 2024 than the Canadian average. And as I mentioned, we've also suffered from the highest rates of inflation. So this is the inflation rate in 2024 for Canada and all the different provinces. Alberta is the province in red, and I apologize for the jumping. I'm told that there's a gym up there, so I think that's what's going on here. Someone's getting a good workout. I hope you don't get seasick watching the screen. But so what you see here is that in 2024, in many cases, by far, we didn't just have a little bit higher inflation than other provinces. We had a lot higher inflation. And I would suggest that that is a result of a number of unique factors to Alberta, because we're, everyone's, whether it's Ontario, Quebec, BC, Alberta, there are global forces that were at play that led to the increase in inflation, as I mentioned, global supply disruptions associated with COVID, the war in Ukraine. But then there are unique things to Alberta. So we are one of the only provinces that has deregulated power, for example. That played a role in having a higher inflation rate than other jurisdictions. Among Western provinces, we also are unique in the sense that we have private auto insurance, and that also played a role in driving up our costs. So there are things that Alberta has done, policy choices that we've made that actually contributed to the higher inflation rate. But that, when you have a higher inflation rate, when wages are stagnating, that's a double whammy for working people. Costs are higher, wages are lower. It reduces your living standard. That's what we're dealing with right now, and that's what, through these reports, we're trying to raise as a red flag. As Albertans should know this, because if we want to address it and turn things around, you have to accept it and then find policy choices, which we'll talk about in a minute, that could help turn these things around. So, this chart just illustrates that we've had the slowest wage growth, hourly wage growth, over the last 5 years. So you can see that most other provinces have actually seen their real after-inflation wages grow a little bit. So the Canadian average wages have grown faster than inflation over the last 5 years, Canada-wide. There has been particularly strong wage growth, and this is notable, in British Columbia, which does not have a conservative government, but also in Quebec, and but the Canadian average is higher. Alberta, once again, is represented in the red bar. We've had the slowest hourly wage growth since 2019 among all Canadian provinces. That was hourly earnings. This is weekly earnings, so it's a little bit less here. And you can see when you look at weekly earnings, average weekly earnings, which includes hourly wages but also salaried workers. So about 65% of our workforce earns hourly wages. The other 35% are on salary. So the salaried wages tend to pull the average up a little bit, because they tend to get paid a little more. Most of our members get paid by the hour, both in the public and private sector. But even when you include the salaried workers that bring up the averages, you can see that over the last 5 years, no other province has seen slower wage growth than Alberta, and that has had the effect of undermining the so-called Alberta Advantage. The final chart that I want to pull from our report has to do with different industrial categories of workers. And this is significant because what it shows is, so like the chart, the bar going to the left is wages that have not kept up with inflation, and the bars going to the right are wages that actually have exceeded inflation. And what this chart shows is that in Alberta, regardless of the occupational category, wages have not kept up with inflation, with a few very small exceptions. So transport, finance, everyone else has seen their wages not keep up with inflation in Alberta, and that includes people working in the oil and gas sector. Their wages have gone down on average too when you adjust for inflation. And that's significant, not only because it's such a big part of our economy, but it also corresponds with a period of very rapid growth in profits. In fact, you know, despite all the whining and complaining about how hard done Alberta is when it comes to oil and gas, our oil and gas companies have never recorded profits higher than they have over the past 5 years. Okay, so they're producing more oil than ever with fewer people, and they're paying them less. Okay, that's the truth about what's happening in Alberta's oil and gas sector. So why is all of this happening at this moment? It's not an accident. It's the result of what we describe in our reports as UCP wage suppression policies and strategies. Those policies and strategies include things like their refusal to increase the minimum wage since 2018, sorry. So 6 years, going on 7 years now, and in that period, we've had some of the highest inflation that we've seen in the last 40 years. And so despite the high inflation, they keep saying that they are not going to increase the minimum wage because that would be too much of a burden, they say, on business. So when they say that they represent Albertans, we understand that they only represent a subset of Albertans, right? And so what's happened with the minimum wage is that the minimum wage is supposed to be a floor that holds everyone up, but under the UCP, it has become an anchor that is dragging everyone down. So in addition to their refusal to increase the minimum wage, there have been other wage suppression policies and strategies implemented by the UCP. So for example, they have made it easier for employers to avoid paying overtime. They've changed the rules on something called overtime averaging. It used to be that employers could average your hours over a 12-week period. And if that was still less than 44 hours a week in Alberta, they say you don't have to pay overtime, right? But what they've done is they said, now you can average it over the whole year. And so if you can average it over the whole year, they can essentially make overtime disappear, okay? And we're a hardworking province. Lots of people counted on overtime to supplement their income. And now they've made it possible for employers to basically pay straight time where in the past they would have had to pay overtime, okay? In addition, the UCP has made it harder to join unions. They've made it harder to negotiate contracts. And they've introduced measures that make it harder for unions to get to the point where they can exercise their power and take strike votes, for example, which is necessary to build worker power and get better leverage at the bargaining table. So I'm going to give you a few examples about all of these things. So when I say they've made it harder to join unions, they have introduced multiple steps before a worker can exercise their constitutionally protected right to join a union. Under the previous government, the NDP, if you reached a certain threshold of people signing up for a union, it was 65% of the people in a bargaining unit, you would be automatically certified. The Conservatives, the UCP has gone back to the old Conservative system of having multiple hoops that workers have to jump through. So not only do you have to get a majority of people signing up to say, I want to join a union, then now they have to go, and at a second step, they have to vote again in a secret ballot vote. That sounds fair, right? That's how we conduct our elections for municipal, provincial, federal. What could possibly be wrong with a secret ballot? Well, nothing, except that in a workplace, you're not as free as you are when you're voting for your municipal government, your municipal representative or your MLA or your MP, because you're in your employer's premises. And what happens under the current system is that it opens up these periods where the employers can threaten, make it clear that they oppose joining a union, they can threaten people, and they intimidate people. So that's not a free and fair election. But that's that's what's happening here in Alberta right now. They've also made it harder to negotiate contracts, especially, I'll give you two examples. In the public sector, our provincial government has introduced what we describe as secret mandates for every agency that is funded by the provincial government, so healthcare, education, universities, colleges, even municipalities. And so they tell whoever's at the bargaining table for those entities that you can not bargain anything above, in this case, it's 7.5% over 4 years. That's what they've been telling people at the bargaining table. So that's taken, it makes a mockery of the notion of collective bargaining, because bargaining is supposed to be about coming together and compromising, right? But they're basically saying no to any kind of compromise, no to any kind of movement, okay? I also mentioned here what we call ESAs. So these are called essential service agreements. This is in the public sector to make sure that public services continue to run even during a strike. Under our legislation, and most people don't know this, but under our legislation, if you're a nurse, if the nursing union, for example, they can't go on strike until they agree to provide a certain level of service even during the strike. So the nurses union, the United Nurses of Alberta, which is one of our affiliate unions, for example, has repeatedly agreed that when it comes to essential services like emergency rooms, intensive care units, they have agreed to provide as much as 90% of their members to come to work even during a strike. And the nurses said, well, okay, we understand that. We're here, we got into the profession to keep people healthy, and we have an obligation to our patients. So they've agreed to as much as 90% essential service coverage. But the government continues to drag out that they can't actually exercise their right to strike until they've first negotiated an essential service agreement, right? And so what the government has been doing has been dragging out negotiations on essential service agreements for months and months and months, thereby undermining the union's ability to negotiate, even though the union is, at the end of the day, is always, they say from the beginning, we're going to provide you enough people to keep these services running, but they still drag their feet, and when I say months, I mean months, not like more than a year, to get them to agree to something that the nurses were basically saying, we will give you what you want, but they're just trying to undermine the collective bargaining process. So there are also restrictions on the right to strike in the private sector. So here in Alberta, and most people probably don't realize this, they've made it so complicated for workers in the construction sector to strike, so they haven't technically taken away their right to strike. They've made them jump through so many hoops that they have never been able to effectively exercise their right to strike since the law was changed in the 80s. So there hasn't been a strike in construction in Alberta since 1979, because they've stacked the rules against workers and so that they can't exercise their right. Employers know this, and so that undermines the bargaining power of workers in that sector. So there's one more recent UCP policy that might not look like a wage suppression strategy, but it most certainly is a wage suppression strategy. Okay, so you may have heard just a couple of weeks ago, Daniel Smith announced the creation of a new Crown Corporation to oversee the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, the rainy day fund that's supposed to take all of our royalties and invest. It's a nest egg for the future. It was created in the Lougheed era, and she's announced that they've created this new corporation to manage investments for the Heritage Fund. That sounds like a good thing. She says, we're going to have a fund that's worth $250 billion by 2050, right? It's only worth about $20 billion right now. So in order to get from there, from $20 billion to $250 billion by 2050, they would have to get investment returns of at least 10% every year. That's unusual. and it's not something that most investment managers can accomplish, right? But more significantly, She says that the money that's going to go into this fund to create this new, bigger heritage fund is going to come from surpluses. So every year there's a surplus. The lion's share of that money under the UCP is now going to go to this investment fund, which many people are suggesting is just going to be a slush fund to make risky investments in companies owned by friends of the UCP, mostly in oil and gas. That's risky enough because that's our heritage. That's our nest egg, right? But what it has to do with bargaining and wages is that it basically says whenever you have a surplus, it goes over here. It doesn't go to hiring more nurses or teachers or doctors or giving them wage increases that keep up with inflation. It is a tool for the government to say the cupboard is bare. We can't afford any wage increases. Okay, that's why it's part of the wage suppression strategy. So the thing that all of these laws and policies and taxes have in common is that they reduce worker bargaining power. And bargaining power is literally what allowed BC and Quebec to move ahead of us in terms of wages. So what do BC and Quebec have in common? They have strong legal frameworks to protect worker bargaining power. So it is no coincidence that is those two provinces that have done best in terms of seeing wages keep up with inflation. The lack of legal and political frameworks that we see here in Alberta is weakening bargaining power, and that is exactly why we're falling behind in terms of wages. So what does all this mean for Alberta? Well, it means that individuals and families are seeing their standard of living slipping, but it's not just individuals and families. When wages fall behind inflation, when purchasing power is impaired, that also has negative impacts for the business community and for the broader economy, because lower wages mean lower consumer spending and lower economic growth. So what does this mean for unions? It means our jobs are harder. It means that we have a bigger gap to bridge when we go to the bargaining table. And that's because there's a harsher climate for us to operate in. It makes, we have less bargaining power than workers and unions have in other provinces. But on the positive side, our members are more motivated than they have been in a very long time. And people are waking up. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we have a chant that we use at some of our rallies, and this is a picture from a rally that we held outside the legislature in October. And it was called the Rally for Respect. It was organized by the Federation of Labour, attended by all of our big unions. We had about 8,000 people out there. And we used this chant, you know, workers' wages under attack. What do we do? Stand up, fight back. So that's what we intend to do. And our challenge as a labor movement, and we very specifically see this as our challenge is to repair Albertans' wounded wages and reverse our slipping standards of labor, standards of living. And we want to do this not just for our members, but for all Albertans. And if we don't do it, who else will? And if we don't do it now, when will we? So this is not a mission impossible for us. We've been describing this as a worker moment to build our power and mobilize it to repair our wounded living standards. And we've created something called the Common Front. But this is our logo. This is not just our AFL unions, but all non-affiliated unions as well, have recently come together. And we had this meeting of provincial union presidents hosted by the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. This was organized by the Federation of Labour, but they hosted us. So public sector, private sector unions, we've created something called the Common Front. We're actually having a town hall, a Common Front town hall in Lethbridge tonight to bring people together to plan for what we're describing as the critical path to success. So right now we've got about 250,000 workers who are at the bargaining table right now, mostly in the public sector. And they will all be in a position, perhaps, to strike between April and June. It is what we're calling our red zone. And our hope is that by using this collective power, pushing back against this wage suppression agenda, we will be able to pull up wages for the workers that we represent, both in the public and private sector, and by doing that, we'll be able to pull up wages for everyone else in this province. So thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Next week's topic, we have an update from our mayor. Blaine Higgin will be here next week to speak to us. So those who want to ask questions, please line up along the wall. State your name and your question briefly. No long preludes, comments, or stories. We expect to be respectful and polite. If you did not want to say your question at the mic, you can just pass me a note with your name, and I'd be happy to ask it for you. So with that, I'll welcome folks to ask the first question.
My name is Maureen Hawkins. My sense is the province's Alberta Calling program was part of voter suppression. I know friends, they claim they don't have enough construction workers, etc. I know construction workers here who are not finding full-time work. I know others who are unionized and who are going like 6 months without a job and then having to take one at $2 or $3 an hour less. And what they complain about is these are people with 30 or 40 years experience, that they're hiring inexperienced people in construction for much less. And these people have come claiming to be experienced construction workers, and the really experienced ones are being pushed out. Is this assessment accurate?
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. Great question, and your assessment is accurate on two fronts. First, when you suggest that the provincial government's so-called Alberta's Calling campaign, which involved ads that were run all across the country claiming that Alberta, other Canadians should come here to boost the Alberta population because we have more jobs and the cost of living was lower here. You remember this. They literally spent millions of dollars on these ads, and people responded. People did come. But they didn't, the UCP made no provisions to make sure that these people actually had work or even places to stay. And the fact that so many people were coming and there weren't proper measures taken to accommodate them actually did contribute to our higher inflation rate, without a doubt, right? So it helped, like in Calgary, for example, where probably a majority of those people ended up landing, we had the highest increase in rents and housing costs in the country, not just in the province, but in the country. And the rate of increase in housing costs has moderated a little bit, but it hasn't gone down, right? So it's ratcheted up. So that really contributed to inflation in this province. In terms of employment in the construction sector, because the Federation of Labour represents public and private sector unions, including unions in construction. And what we're hearing from our construction unions is that employers are exploiting workers, especially on residential construction projects, but also some commercial projects. They are, frankly, taking advantage of the temporary farm worker program to hire workers who often don't have the same level of certification and experience and skill to build projects, once again, especially residential projects. And this is a tough one for us because we don't want to target people who are coming to our country. We are a country of immigrants, and we want to encourage that kind of thing. But when people are being brought in as guest workers and being used as pawns to drive down wages and conditions, that's bad for them because they're being exploited, but it's also bad for our existing workforce. So it is kind of a perverse situation where we've got a lot of construction projects going on. and we've got governments saying we need to build more, especially housing, but a lot of our construction workers with experience are sitting idle. And so this is an issue that we've been raising. It's falling on deaf ears with the UCP. We did, not surprising, we did actually have quite a decent reception with the federal government. They actually made some big changes in terms of guest worker programs. They've ratcheted down a lot over the last 6 months, and that was had a lot to do with our lobbying efforts, but it's still an ongoing issue.
Hi, Gil. Thanks for coming down from Edmonton. It's always a little weird and uncomfortable to meet somebody that you follow on Twitter. Last year in Lethbridge, we lost a Starbucks location, allegedly because the workers there tried to organize, and Starbucks closed that particular location. Last month or the month before, Amazon in Quebec closed their 7 locations there because the workers there wanted to organize a union. So I, in both cases, not having anything more to do with Starbucks or Amazon, but I was wondering if you could comment on those two situations. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. And this is not new. For generations, for as long as we can remember, employers have done their best to keep unions out. You know, there are all sorts of union busting tactics. So it's true. It happened in the 20s and 30s. It happened in the 60s and 70s. It's happening now. So we're never going to get to a situation where we can stop union busting efforts from employers entirely, but we can get to a point where we make them pay a price for doing that. And the difference between the closure of the Starbucks store here in Lethbridge and what's happening in Quebec is a case in point. Okay, so when everyone knows that they closed that Starbucks location here in Lethbridge to bust the union and thwart the efforts by these workers to exercise their constitutionally protected right to join a union. And I emphasize that is a constitutionally protected right to join a union and bargain a collective agreement. Everyone knows that's what happened here, right? But there were no consequences, right? But if you look in Quebec, the Quebec government and the federal government have both responded to what Amazon did there by saying that they're going to, like the Quebec government in particular said they're going to rip up all their contracts with Amazon. So they connected the dots. They said, we see what you're doing and you're going to pay a price, right? We can't stop you as a business from leaving the province, but we're not going to do any business with you, right? And so that's why elections matter. It matters who we vote for. And I want to just sort of stress this point that worker rights don't exist in a vacuum. They are, in many instances, the result of a legal framework that has been put in place by governments to reflect what we value as a society, right? Because, you saw that starting, say, with the New Deal in the United States, before FDR and the New Deal in the 1930s. Employers were able to hire goons to beat up workers. Sometimes they killed workers, they threatened them, they fired them. And, unions would fight back, but we never got protected rights until we elected governments that were worker-friendly and said it was in society and the economy's best interest to actually give bargaining power to workers. They created legal frameworks, and we can't take those things for granted, right? We have to elect people who share these values, create these frameworks to counterbalance the power of corporations, right? So the reason they get away with here in Alberta is frankly because we have politicians who hate unions, are willing to, to undermine our rights, but there is an alternative and we have to always remember that. Like like workers' rights have to be front and center in our political discussions, because if we don't have worker-friendly governments, worker-friendly policies, there are consequences, and the main consequence is that bargaining power gets eroded. That doesn't just hurt unions and unionized workers, it hurts everyone.
Hey, Gil, how you doing? Yeah, Ken Sears. Gil's probably heard some of this before because I keep reverting to it, but we're talking about the loss of the Alberta Advantage. And that Alberta Advantage, there has always been a disparity between the income of people in rural Alberta and urban Alberta. People have to leave their homes to go to the oil patch to make a living so their kids can grow up in the town they grew up in. The average wage, and I haven't seen numbers on this, but I will stand behind it just because I'm almost positive it's true. People that live in small towns make less. The stable, solid core of a small town economy are unionized workers. It is the professional workers, the ATA workers, the teachers, the nurses, to some extent, not so much anymore, the people that were working on road construction and stuff with provincial government contracts. That is eroding along with everybody else, but they were starting from a lower starting point. And that is affecting people and just society in these towns. Because we are no longer a rural society, we are an urban society. But those people are still out there, and they are still members of our society, of our community. And we cannot afford to create something that we have, and I'm lecturing, that we have seen in places like the Appalachians, where you suddenly have impoverished rural communities. So I want to know what the AFL and their member unions are doing about that. And I want to make one fast suggestion. The Alberta government just changed the regulations regarding people having to register to vote in municipal elections. That just came through very quietly. Is the AFL, and I haven't read the law, that legislation in about a year and a half, is the AFL doing anything to quietly encourage our members, our affiliates, our friends to register to vote in those municipal elections?
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Ken. Well, Ken knows this, but most of you probably. I grew up in rural Alberta. I grew up on a farm, went to elementary school in a town of like 250 people, Clyde, Alberta. Went to high school in Westlock, Alberta. So questions about rural Alberta and the viability of the economy in rural Alberta are really near and dear to my heart. I think it's really important for us to point out that unionized jobs are the backbone of a lot of these small communities, right? And Ken mentioned teachers and nurses, but I would actually also point out there's a whole bunch of other people, working in public facilities that performed a similar role. So like if you had a long-term care facility, for example. So it's not just professional people, it's, people who work, worked in the cafeteria or cleaned the schools. And some of those are, like, I remember those, some of those, in those communities, those jobs, like in a city, they might be a little bit lower paid, but in a smaller community, the money goes further. But what's been happening over the last 20 years is a lot of that work has gotten privatized. So that has hurt those individual families, but it has hurt the rural communities as well. So I don't have a single solution to that, but I think we do have to start talking about not just the Alberta Advantage, but the union advantage, and that if you got union jobs, it's not just good for the people who have them, but it's also good for the whole community. On the subject of registration, this is an American, like the UCP, let's make no mistake, the UCP is MAGA North. They are the Canadian version of the Republican Party, and they are using a lot of their same tactics. And one of the tactics that the Republicans have been using, sadly to great effect, over the past number of decades is voter suppression. Right? So I talked about wage suppression. They're also big on voter suppression. And registration is about adding another hoop, and they do it with workers too, lots of hoops to jump through to exercise your rights. They want to create more hoops for people to jump through before they can exercise their right to vote. And so in the same way as, you know, the progressives in the States have responded by doing voter registration drives, we've never had to do that in Canada because you didn't have to register to vote. But if that's what it means for us to elect progressive people, then that's what we in the labor movement are going to have to do. We'll work with community partners to start registration drives. I didn't think I'd ever get to that point, but yes, we would be committed to doing that, because winning elections really matters. And I have a number of folks from the AFL here. Our Secretary Treasurer, Corey Longo, is here. She's the other elected officer. And Ian Hussey, our Director of Research, and also have Joe Irving, our Director of Organizing. And he actually put up a little sign just to say, just remind them what happened when the New Democrats were elected in terms of worker bargaining power. And this goes to the question about consequences for companies that bust unions. Under the NDP, they actually had a rule that if you fired or someone during an organizing drive or otherwise violated worker rights, the labor board actually had the ability to actually automatically certify the bargaining unit. That was the consequence. The consequence wasn't just a fine. It's like, you're trying to stop these workers from unionizing. Guess what? They're unionized now. And so that's the difference it makes of having worker-friendly politicians in charge of your government. Like they can change rules, and because these guys change rules to make it harder for working people, we elect progressives, we can change rules to make it easier and a more supportive environment for working people, and that's what we're looking for.
Hi, Gil. Thanks very much for coming and a great presentation. I'm Maria Fitzpatrick. 42 years I worked in paid employment. 36 years I was the member of a union. And one of the first things I learned was an injury to one is an injury to all, not just union members, but to your entire community. So if we don't stand up as a community and back our unionized workers and support them, letters to your MLAs, MPs, etc., if you don't make sure you're registered to vote in the municipal election, we are screwed. So my question to you is, how do we engage the public in supporting our unions? Because the talk is always, oh, it's unions, unions. I know because I was a recipient of pay equity because my union fought for it for 15 years. So how do we engage the public? Thanks, Gil.
Thanks, Maria. I mean, this is a perennial question. If I were to answer it with one word, it's that unions have to engage workers and build support for our unions by winning. And that's what we're trying to do. We're through our federation, cooperating with our affiliated unions, the non-affiliated unions, we're trying to build a common front to build worker power, and we want to use that worker power to get better collective agreements that increase wages, improve our living standards. And at the end of the day, when it comes to organizing workers and winning over support, there's no better calling card than increased standards of living, right? Because that's what it's about. Like we've tried this, information campaigns, and I don't want to dismiss them, and appeals to people's values and their history, and that all that's great, right? Because I'm proud of what we do in the labor movement. It makes a big difference. But the thing that really convinces people is results. And I can tell you, and in fact, I was just chatting with some people about the oil and gas industry, which is generally non-union in this province. But the difference between pay in some of our unionized oil and gas facilities versus the non-unionized facilities, it's vast. It's vast. I mean, like, people think that everyone in oil and gas make huge amounts of money, and some of them do. But in the unionized facilities, mostly refineries, upgraders, and some gas and petrochemical facilities, the union advantage is sometimes in the order of like 20% higher wages, and not just that, but benefits and pensions, right? I was just chatting with Tom McLeod here, who some of you know. He's one of your active participants in SACPA, and Tom worked for the International Woodworkers Association in British Columbia, and he managed disability benefits. Right? I also point out that he was telling me a story about how he was the campaign manager for Grant Notley when he won a couple of times up in Spirit River, Fairview. So you have someone here with a real track record. But the point is, he was telling me about the benefits that unionized workers working in the forestry sector had in British Columbia, and it continue to have. But you compare that to the non-union, it's huge, right? I mean, so we make a difference.
Hi, I'm Henning Mundel, and mine are a couple of questions, but it's all the same topic. Whereas in the US, the percentage of unionized workers, I guess since Reagan, has really gone down way beyond Canada. But I wonder, you've given us the charts to show Alberta's position in terms of wages and relation to inflation. Could you compare public sector union versus private sector union and percentage of Alberta workers that are unionized, contrasted to BC and Quebec, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a good question. This probably comes as no surprise to you, but Alberta has the lowest rate of unionization in Canada. It's not an accident. It's a result of our labor laws that make it harder to join a union. So it's not, and this has been a long-standing issue in Alberta from previous Conservative governments, especially now the UCP. So about 25% of working Albertans are members of unions overall, but the unionization rate is much higher in the public sector than it is in the private sector, mostly because traditionally our governments have been less hostile to people joining unions in the public sector. So about 70% of public sector workers in Alberta are unionized, and only about 12% of our private sector workers are unionized. And there are many reasons for that, but like as I said, it's hard. Like employers can exert their opposition to unionization in the private sector more easily. The private sector is also more atomized, and so you have smaller workplaces, and the result, and our legislation basically says you have to organize workplace by workplace. In the public sector, we can organize across whole sectors. Right? Like all the nurses, for example, are members of the United Nurses of Alberta, whereas when we're organizing Starbucks locations, we literally have to do it one store at a time. And so one of the things that we've been advocating for is what we call sectoral bargaining, which is what they have in Europe, where you basically, you organize a whole sector, like, public or private sector, right? So you say, like, all the fast food restaurants in Lethbridge, or maybe even the whole province. And if people working in the Starbucks location, every store should be able to vote and say, do you want to be part of a union? And if they say yes, they get a province-wide certification. That's not the way it works right now, so it makes it really hard for people to exercise that right. So that's why we call for sectoral bargaining. So the final point I'll make is that so rules matter, the way you set it up, and one of the reasons we have low unionization in the private sector is because the rules have been set up in a way that has made it hard for people to exercise their rights, right? BC, and the difference between, it's a little bit higher in BC, but they have the same discrepancy between public and private sector. I'd say about maybe 20% in BC or in the private sector are organized, but they have this local level, enterprise level bargaining too. Until we actually have sectoral bargaining in the private sector, when we essentially do have sectoral bargaining in the public sector, which gives the public sector an advantage. If we really want to change that and give workers in the private sector real rights to join a union and come together and bargain collectively, sectoral bargaining is an answer, but it needs to be enshrined in the legal framework. So that's one of the things we're pushing for.
Got to be brief. My name is Mark Gettle. So all the information you present is basically based on averages, but averages sometimes can skew the real situation. And Henning asked the difference between union and non-unionized, and I'm under the impression that the oil patch worker actually makes a lot more money than the average worker, much more than any other province. So we're unique in that we have a large proportion. So if you take that out of your average, does that not mean that the average non-oil patch worker is actually making a lot less than the average wage earner in the rest of the provinces?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the short answer is yes. Yeah, I mean, oil and gas is a gold-plated industry, and as a result, they've been able to pay higher wages, and you're right, those wages do pull up the averages. So if you do pull out oil and gas, the averages paid to people working in other sectors are actually dramatically lower. And so even those charts suggest that we're starting to fall behind other provinces. If we were to take oil and gas out, we'd not be in third place. We wouldn't be above the Canadian average. We'd be, without a doubt, we would be below the Canadian average. There's also regional differences, and I'll be blunt about this. A community like Lethbridge, probably your average wages, especially if you pull out oil and gas, are probably dramatically lower than the Alberta average, and as a result, also dramatically lower than the Canadian average. So there is not an Alberta advantage for people outside oil and gas, and there is not an Alberta advantage for people outside of the sort of the boom towns like Fort McMurray.
Thanks, Gil. I'm Ian Hurdle. If you could comment on two things. With the government having a mandate approach, it seems they've got their finger on the scale for the whole province. So if you live in high level, you can't have a differential wage. The second thing is there a place in our society for some of the major boards, companies, like in Germany, where the union actually sits on the board and knows what's happening, what they can afford in wages?
Yeah, those are two really good questions, and we do look over at Western Europe, places like Germany, France, even Italy. There's a reason why their standard of living generally is as high as it is. They have, good wages, better benefits, but once again, it goes back to the legal framework, and the legal framework that's put in place by progressive politicians does have a huge bearing on how much people are paid, what your living standards are, how much vacation time you have, all those things that contribute to a better life. They flow from a worker-friendly legal framework. And in Germany, the legal framework includes sectoral bargaining, which I mentioned, but it also includes provisions to have worker representatives on the boards of big corporations. And that allows workers to have an informed look into how the companies where their members work, how well they're doing, and it encourages more constructive bargaining because everyone has the same information, right? And so it's not an accident that in countries like Germany, agreements are usually reached without recourse to strike. It's much more collegial. There will be differences of opinion, but agreements are generally reached, and they tend to be more fair because the union representatives on the board can say, we know exactly how much money he made last year, and we're not against profit. We want our companies to be profitable, but we want the workers to share in it in a more fulsome way, right? So, some of those companies are some of the most successful companies in the world. This notion that if you have a union in a workplace, or that if you pay your workers well, that somehow that's bad for business, nothing could be further from the truth, right? And that's one of the things that we have to emphasize as unions, that unions are not anathema to prosperity. In fact, quite the opposite, right? It's about promoting success, but also making sure that success is widely shared, right? So there's some really negative stereotypes about unions, but I think when you point to examples like the German example, you show that unions can actually be really good partners in prosperity if given the opportunity.
Well, Gil, I really want to thank you. Oh, another question? Okay, we've gone over time, so what's one more? And I want to thank the audience for those who have stayed, so I appreciate that.
Reynolds here. You know, I'm concerned about the troubled times we're in right now with the tariffs and whatnot. I'm wondering if you go and push for higher wages, the businesses are going to suffer desperately. And with the businesses, with the turbulence that exists right there, I'm wondering, you had indicated that the next 3 months was the time to push for this other aspect, but I think the businesses are the ones that are really going to be in turbulent times.
Yeah. Thanks.
Reynolds Delarsis.
Yeah, thanks, Reynolds. That's a fair question, and it's one that we've heard. I've sort of addressed it already. I actually don't think we should buy this argument that wage increases are bad for the economy, or that wage increases are bad for employers, because, and I'm going to try to put this in a nutshell, the economy is people. And there has been this narrative that's developed over the last 40 years or so that the economy is business and investment and the captains of industry. But at the end of the day, the economy is actually people working, people getting paid, people buying goods, and if money isn't going into people's pockets, then it's not being spent in the economy, right? And so I mentioned FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had a famous quote when he was presented with a question like this way back in the 30s, and he said, the best friend of business is a worker with money in his pocket. And that is as true today as it was then. And I would actually say that in the face of the tariff threat, instead of capitulating, as our premier has done, and basically, embracing a strategy of what I would describe as appeasement, what we in Canada need to do is to stand up to the bully, because we all know bullies in our own personal lives, and bullies don't respect weakness. They only respond to strength. And I'm very pleased that most of our leaders in this country seem to understand that, from the federal government to most of our provincial governments. They're presenting a united Team Canada approach. And in fact, just last night, the leaders of the Canadian Labour Movement, through the Canadian Labour Congress, we had a meeting, which I participated in virtually. And we are full, 100% behind the Team Canada approach, and to the point where we're actually saying that we might have to make some sacrifices ourselves in the short term to push back against the bully. Because let's be clear, like these 25% tariffs, we've got a short-term reprieve, but it's only a reprieve. The threat still hangs over our head. If Trump proceeds with those threats and implements the 25% tariffs, that will cause a recession. Like, thousands of jobs will be lost, and we don't know how long he would keep those tariffs in place. So it might not just be thousands and thousands of Canadian jobs lost for a short term, it could be forever, right? And so we in the labor movement, along with most of the premiers in the federal government, have basically said, we have to push back, and that probably means it could include like strong measures like our own retaliatory tariffs, but also non-tariff measures like cutting off our exports of things that the American businesses really need, like lumber, like electricity, and frankly, in the context of the Alberta economy, oil and gas. Will that mean some job losses here, some pain for our businesses? Yes, it will. But our feeling is that it has to be short-term pain for long-term gain. We have to stop this attack, and that means pressuring them where it hurts, right? And the good news is that the Americans actually have built their economy based around access to a lot of our resources. And, whether it's the auto sector, like the parts manufacturing in Ontario, or oil and gas from Alberta that is like the 100% feedstock for refineries in the American Midwest, that's leverage. And so instead of, being fearful and saying, if we stand up to these guys, we have to do what they say, if that's the approach you take, then this is a quote from someone else, but the bully will eat you one bite at a time, right? They keep moving the goalposts. We capitulate to them now. It'll be another ask later on. So better for us to stand up now, push against the bully, even if that means short-term pain for us. It means that we might lose a few jobs in the short term, but we'll protect more of them in the longer term. So.
Okay, I think with that, I want to thank Gil for being here today, and I want to thank the audience for staying over. I am not the best moderator, but thank you so much again for being here, and thank you so much, Gil, for your time and your expertise. So.